Alright, hello and welcome to a build update and overview of the Vortex of Berserking Whisperer I've been playing in the Legacy of Freesia event. We are now way further along into the event, a few weeks now, right, I think. So a lot of changes have been made to the character and build, so it'd be a good time to do a full overview and sort of go over exactly what a more endgame version of this character looks like. It's not perfect just yet, still always have a way to go. That's sort of the way with POE 1, you can always make your character better in some way or another, which is cool. But I think this is very close to a at least a very solid shell for the endgame version, so I'd like to show you sort of what I've done. So I've been doing pretty much all the content in the game with this. It just steamrolls Ubers and tier 17s, juiced ones, and right now I'm forming Rogue Exiles, like fully map modded, like really pretty juiced up idols, like all the map mods are tripled or whatever. So yeah, pretty much just like the most juiced Titanic setup with the legends and stuff like that, and it's been doing super well. The defensive layers actually work quite well for those maps. Those maps do get very rippy, so depending on how you roll them, the character can sometimes get popped, because especially if you roll a bunch of Xandros, because this is an evasion character, so the exile that has hits can't be evaded, you can imagine can be kind of rough. But in general, I think the defensive layers of this actually are really good for those maps, which has been very cool. And the damage is of course there, everything just melts, and you have this huge AoE with circle, so they've been feeling really fun to form. So to do a quick overview for the people who maybe didn't watch the first video, what this character is, it's a Vortex of Berserking Whisperer character. So what is Vortex of Berserking? Well, it is a melee attack that sort of does a speedy strike, and if you use it while you have over 10 rage, it puts this thing around you, a big spinning blade that basically just follows you around and acts like sort of a righteous fire, but like a melee fizz version, which is very cool and very fun. And this thing lasts for as long as you have rage. Basically, it drains your rage with the same mechanic as Berserk does. So it starts off with a certain base rage drain and then drains more and more rage every second, completely identically to the way Berserk does it, just it starts at a lower base than Berserk, I believe. So you need to sustain rage in order to keep it up for a very long time. And I believe on this character right now, like during maps, you get like 40 seconds to a minute uptime generally on a single cast, which is pretty good. So the problem with that skill, right, it's really cool. You can scale AoE with it, and like Righteous Fire, it feels really good to play. You don't really have to do much, just run around and things die around you, and that's cool, very cool. The problem with it, however, is that if you look at the gem, this has a effectiveness of added damage of 72%, which means it's a pretty weak skill. It really doesn't do very much damage on its own, so if you were to just use it, let's say honestly, you probably wouldn't do very much damage. However, there's a bunch of mechanical quirks to this skill that makes it scale way higher than you might imagine it would. So the main important thing that makes this skill scale a lot higher than you might think it does is snapshotting. So snapshotting has been removed from a lot of sources in POE 1. Basically for most things it doesn't exist, but for this skill it still does exist quite a bit. So what does snapshotting mean? Well, basically, if you cast Vortex of Berserking, it will snapshot the links you use to cast it. So you can see right now I have it in a sort of 12 link setup. So I have a full link weapon here with a squire, and it is all socketed here with the gem. So it has functionally sort of 11 or 12 links. So what happens is when you cast it with this link setup, it will snapshot the links, but it'll dynamically update the stats. So what you can do is you can cast it, then you can weapon swap to a big stat stick like this and another shield. And what happens is it'll still keep, for the duration of this Rage Vortex, it'll treat it as if it had 11 links, but it will use the stats of this much juicier weapon alongside the new shield. So you can imagine that leads to a lot of extra damage. This like at least triples your damage, probably quads it. It's like some absurd multiplier. So that's first of all very strong. And not only that, it also snapshots exertions. So exertions come from war cries. So you use a war cry and it exerts a certain number of melee attacks, and Rage Vortex of Berserking is a melee attack, contrary to what you might think. So it will exert that melee attack, and then for the duration of the Blaze Storm, no matter if you weapon swap or anything, that exert will be permanent. So for the entire duration of the Rage Storm, the exert will be active. So what we do is we use Intimidating Shout, which is a shout that gives the exerted attacks double damage. What this means is if you just simply cast Intimidating Shout and then cast your Rage Vortex, this thing will permanently deal double damage. You get 100% double damage chance, basically, on this entire storm for the duration of the storm. So not only do you get 11 links plus a really juicy stat stick, you also get permanent double damage, basically, from this shout exertion. So you can see how this works in order to just stack a bunch of more multipliers on this very, baseline weak skill in order to really make it scale out the wazoo. And this is not even the end of how much we can scale this, because since we are a Whisper this league, so Whisper is obviously deck stacking, mana stacking, so you have about 13,000, almost 14 mana right now. So we're stacking a bunch of mana, and now obviously since we don't need to use the Squire for the new weapon swap here, because obviously it snapshots the links, right? We can use a new shield. So what we do is we use Mana Storm. So Mana Storm is a very cool shield. It's from one of the tier 17 bosses, I believe. It has that final line there, which is why we use it. Whenever you cast a spell, you sacrifice all your mana in order to gain added maximum lightning damage equal to half of the sacrificed mana for 4 seconds. So given that we have, about 14,000 mana, whenever, we cast a spell with full mana, we get, 7,000 added flat, basically maximum, which is pretty huge. That is a lot of flat damage, which is, also just a massive damage multiplier. So basically 11 links, big stat stick, permanent double damage, and then we get the Mana Storm flat damage. Now, how are we scaling that flat damage? Well, we are using Indigon. So I'll go over exactly how we're triggering this, because of course Rage Vortex of Berserking does not have a mana cost, it only costs a life. So we can't really use that in order to proc Indigon on its own, but we have a system for that, and it's actually very cool. And I'll go over that just in a bit here. But basically, Indigon, we are very quickly maxing out Indigon stacks, which gives us the full 2000% spell damage. So we have the flat damage from the shield, which gives us a ton of flat, and then we get a ton of percent from Indigon because, again, Whisper has this Battle Mage's Cry node here, that your mind is destroyed, which gives you increases and reductions to spell damage, also apply to attacks at 150% of their value. So this 2000% spell damage we get from the Indigon becomes 3000% attack damage, which then scales the massive amount of flat from the Mana Storm shield, and then that gets baked into this 11 link big stat stick setup. So now you probably get how this skill does, the amount of damage that it does. There are just so many things, mechanical quirks to it, that just let it scale crazily. Of course, it's not the highest damage build in the game, but it is sitting on like around 300 mil DPS, I believe, in this setup, if you let it ramp a little bit, which it's pretty good for a 70% damage effectiveness skill, so that is pretty cool. Now, of course, Indigon has a bunch of caveats to it, right? You need to spend a bunch of mana. So how are we doing that? Well, and this also ties into how we're gaining rage. So as you remember, I said that Rage Vortex of Berserking continuously drains rage, as you can see here. But you can also see that I'm topping up on rage right now, and this is without even doing anything. Because what we are doing is we are using more tech with the Whisper. So we are using an automation setup with Plague Bearer. Now, Plague Bearer, you can just ignore all the text on the skill except for the cooldown. This does nothing for the build. It's literally just here because it casts twice a second. So it's a low cooldown skill that you can automate. It's literally it. So this has a mana cost to it. If you trigger a spell, you still need to pay the mana cost. So this is the whole idea here. On its own, this doesn't cost very much mana. Right now, it costs 200-ish mana. This is not the base. I believe the base is like 40 or something. It's just that it's been casting a while, so it's been getting a little ramped by Indigon. But the idea is you have this on automation, so it just spams twice a second, and then you use a big spender like, say, Arcane Cloak, which spends 65% of your current mana. Now, this is important because if you were to use any other spell that doesn't have like that baked-in mana spend into the skill, it would proc the Mana Storm, and that would sacrifice all your mana and basically not spend any mana at all, because sacrificing mana does not count as spending it for the purpose of Indigon. So you need a spell that sort of just spends mana as part of the skill, because this thing, when you cast Arcane Cloak, it'll first spend the mana, and then it'll use the remaining mana left in your pool to do the Mana Storm stuff. So you always have the 65% spend there. So of course, spending 65% mana with our massive 14,000 mana is spending a ton of mana for Indigon. This will give you a bunch of Indigon stacks to make your skills cost a lot more mana, because as you can see, it has that line 57% increased cost of skills for each 200 total mana spent recently. So this will ramp the Plague Bearer to, instead of costing 200 mana, if we cast our Arcane Cloak once, it now costs 1,267, right? And then of course, if I were attacking enemies and leeching here, this will refill, and then it would keep ramping, but now it's dropping because my mana is not being leeched. But yes, so it'll make it cost 1,200, and then that will start chaining itself. Basically, as long as you're refreshing your mana, it'll start costing more and more each trigger, because Indigon keeps stacking itself up. So it's like an enabler, basically. Clicking on Arcane Cloak once enables this sort of feedback loop of Plague Bearer, where it's just costs more and more mana and spends more and more mana, and basically almost instantly maxes your Indigon stacks for one, and also gives you full rage sustain because of this one Whisper node. Wait a little. So this node gives you 10 rage after spending 200 mana. So that is how I'm getting rage right now. And in actual combat, when you have the Indigon stacks ticking on the Plague Bearer, this thing will keep your rage up for a long time. So it's a very elegant sort of solution there, and it's very cool. So it solves two things for you. It solves both the Indigon stacks, and it'll solve your rage gen. So it's actually pretty cool, and it works very well. Now, there are some caveats to this system, right? And this is something that I didn't anticipate first when putting the character together, but after playing it for a week or two, this can be very apparent. And I'm sure if any of you have actually tried playing the character after the original video, you've also noticed this. So the big clunkiness with the build, except for having to weapon swap. I personally don't mind that, but I think weapon swap is like, if you play with it for like a day, you get used to it and it feels fine, but you do have to get used to it. But yes, besides that, the big clunkiness of the build was after you cast your first Rage Vortex, right, and you have the full duration, you get all the Indigon stacks, and you do a ton of damage. Once that inevitably runs out, because of course it is gonna run out, eventually the rage cost is just gonna ramp, and it'll run out, so you can't ever have infinite. But so once the first one's run out and you need to recast it, what then happens is, since you've been spending all that mana, you then have like a maxed out Indigon, and that makes the life cost on Rage Vortex of Berserking cost more than your entire life pool, and that makes you not being able to cast it. So what happens is, after your first storm runs out, you then have to run around for like 4 or 5 seconds or something like that in order to wait for the Indigon stacks to fall off. And this is very awkward. This does not feel great, and yeah, this is something I tried to solve for a while. But only recently have you figured out a really elegant solution of this. So this is credit a little bit from Absolth in the Twitch chat, who also actually came up with the original Plague Bearer setup. So Absolth just shooting out all these great ideas for this build. So what Absolth noticed was that if you unequip the Indigon, it'll instantly reset all the Indigon stacks. So all your costs will instantly become normal again. Because that is how it works, what you can do is you can get stats on your weapons. You can see that I've changed this mirror axe here, and this is the reason why, if you saw the video, we had originally crafted on actual crit on this, and not crafted, but then we had to annul that and instead put on this strength in the crit node because we need to use this tech. So the tech is, you gain some stats from this axe on the weapon swap that you then lose when you swap weapons with other setup, and you set up your stats so that this helmet does not meet its requirements when you weapon swap. So what happens is then, when you weapon swap to your Link setup, where you recast your Rage Vortex, it disables the Indigon automatically, because of course there's a gem in here that you can't cast. So right now I put my Arcane Cloak in here, which requires 159 int, and on the weapon swap I only have 133, whereas on the regular setup I do have over 159, so it enables the Indigon. So when you weapon swap, it instantly disables the Indigon, and that means that no matter when you're casting Rage Vortex, it always costs the base cost, so it always costs 419 life. And then you swap back, and now it'll start ramping again. And the interesting part about this is actually, and I don't know why this works, but this is how it works. When you weapon swap back and re-enable the Indigon, the stacks from before you disable it still stay, so you keep all that ramp and all the damage bonus, which is like kind of cool. It's not like a huge deal. It'll eventually, eventually all the like mana costs cost more than your entire mana bar, and it'll all reset and you have to start over again, but still, it's very cool. It actually works really well, and solves pretty much all the little clunkiness that I felt with the build just by this simple change. So this is a really big discovery for me at least, and it made this character feel so much better. So I would highly recommend, if any of you are trying this build out, to try get this working, because this makes the build feel just infinitely better. So a big recommend there. It is very, very cool. So that is all the rage sustain and damage source and stuff like that. But of course, you might wonder, how are we gaining mana, right? Because this Plague Bearer setup costs a ton of mana. It basically just completely drains you all constantly and just keeps spending and spending and spending. So how are we, refreshing this mana? I don't think there's like any amount of mana regen unless you're like fully stacking it that could sustain this for any reasonable amount of time. Well, there's basically this, which you might have seen when I hovered over the axe. There's this Citadel's enchant on axes, and this is why the stat stick we are using is an axe. This is the mana leech from hits with this weapon is instant enchant. So this is a Settler's Runesmithing enchant that you just put on the weapon, and it is very powerful. Why is it very powerful? Well, this is full instant leech. So if you, for any of the older folks out there who maybe played back in the days of POE 1 with old Vol Pact, you know how busted full instant leech is. This is not something that exists in the game anymore. It has very much been capped for a reason, because old Vol Pact is just completely broken. It's hard to overstate just how much better it is than just this 10% of Leech's instant mastery. Basically, whenever you hit an enemy or two, it just completely fills up your entire mana bar, basically every hit. I believe on pure single target, you need like maybe 2 or 3 hits in order to refill fully, but you have a lot of attack speed, so that's not really a big deal anyway. But as long as there are like 2 enemies, it's like every single tick, you just fully refill your entire mana bar, which is just completely insane, and sustains this character just completely on its own, and is one of the core cornerstones, I believe, of this character. Without this enchant, I probably wouldn't play this build. You definitely need it, because it makes you just feel a lot better, and sort of enables all the different wacky setups here. So that is how we are gaining our mana back. So there's a lot of, moving pieces here, and quirky bits, but I think it's been very fun to put this together, and very cool sort of conceptual build here, and it actually works really well. As I said, as long as you don't mind the weapon swap stuff, it's actually quite a cool character. So yeah, otherwise for the character, we are a Whisperer, currently sitting on 1700, almost 1800 dex, and that'll scale eventually more as well. So we are scaling dex because with the Whisperer, dex gets mana instead of int. You also get more mana per dex than per int, so that's a very powerful node. And then we are doing all the mana stacking stuff, so we of course we're taking Mind Over Matter for the DR, so it scales our defenses and offenses, classic stacker build, a good little framework there. As for other defensive layers for the setup, so we have Fortify, that is one of the links in the weapon here in the Rage Vortex setup. We just straight up using Fortify support. I think it's pretty good. This gives permanent 20 Fortify, which is very nice. That's just a bunch of DR, which is a nice little defensive layer. You can also get like on the chest implicit, you could maybe replace the less damage taken with the Fortify thing, and that would make you able to replace the Fortify support with another support if you so wish. I don't think that opportunity cost is really worth, given that Fortify support is like an okay damage support on its own as well. So I think it's pretty good. So we have Fortify. We're also doing Mageblood stuff. So I've swapped over to Mageblood. I started this character as Headhunter. This character actually scales very well as a Headhunter character, and would recommend that if you're maybe starting out early. I would definitely recommend getting a Headhunter. It makes the character feel really good, especially if you're doing like really juiced content this league with like a bunch of monster modifiers. Headhunter just goes crazy, as you maybe saw in the last video. But right now we're doing Mageblood, and I'm using Sublime Vision. So Sublime Vision, Purity of Fire, alongside Tempered by War with a Watcher's Eye that also shifts. So this gives you 100% cold and lightning damage shifted to fire. So now with Purity of Fire on and a Ruby Flask, we are fully shifting to fire, so you no longer need any cold or lightning res for any reason at all, which is very nice because the character before, when I was using the Headhunter and I wasn't using Sublime, was very suffix starved. It's very difficult to fit in resists on the character because of course you want like suppression, you want dexterity, and suddenly you don't have any suffixes left. So it's very nice being able to just basically get fully res capped at 90% with just setting up a Purity of Fire Sublime setup. Of course, this is a very high-end setup, but this is again a late game character, pretty min-maxed. So this is what I've been doing. It's also a very nice defensive layer. Not only can you just click any sort of Eater altar for res that you want, because of course cold and lightning res don't do anything, but you're also immune to things like penetration. Like non-fire penetration doesn't do anything for you because they're not doing any cold or lightning damage because it all gets shifted to fire. So those penetrations don't do anything, which is very cool. That's a very good defensive layer, especially if you're like in the middle of a Shaper fight or something like that. None of those attacks kind of do anything, which is nice and feels good. Otherwise, just fully Chaos Reps capped, of course. A decent bit of life here, and of course the mana with Minor Matter. Also I'm trying to fit more of these in, but this Will Shaper node, I'm gonna have it on a Megalomaniac right now. It's actually very powerful. Gives you 5% of max mana as a maximum energy shield. It gives you a lot. Basically, I think this node on its own gives me close to 1,000 energy shield. So I want to fit in more of those. It's just kind of tricky. It's a very tight tree right now, so I want to try and balance that out. But yeah, that's a goal of mine, to try and fit more of these in. Of course, if you're not doing Sublime, the big costs of course running a Sublime Vision setup on a mana character is that you can't use Clarity, and Clarity has some of the very best Water Sign mods for a mana character. You see it has the mod right here, damage taken from mana before life, while affected by Clarity. The stacks with Minor Matter, so you could get like a bunch, up to 10% more Minor Matter, I believe. You can also get a bunch of mana recoup on there, and you can also get a bunch of extra mana as ES on there as well. So you can get really good Clarity mods on Watcher's Eyes. So it is unfortunate that we can't really use that, but I think it's worth it for the Sublime setup, because the Sublime setup is just that strong for Ailment. I think it's very good. Otherwise, we are stacking a bunch of evasion. So Dexterity, of course, gives us a percent evasion as well. So we get a bunch of percent evasion from that, alongside a Jade Flask with the Mageblood. Sets this character right now at 33k evasion, which is pretty good. You can also switch to one of the Flask suffixes. Right now, I'm using the Crafted Regen mod on here. You could easily swap this to increase evasion, and this puts the character up to about 45k, I believe. And you can do some shenanigans with that. Like I have a source of blind from this Abyss Jewel as well, so I'm blinding the enemies. And you can do, if you like put Wind Dancer on here, you'd have to move this gem, but if you put Wind Dance on here, you could pretty easily, I think, get Evade capped, which is pretty cool. So that is quite nice. Anyone who's played Evade capped characters knows that feels very good. And of course, with Evasion and the ES, I took Ghost Dance. Ghost Dance is just a really nice little defensive layer. Gives you a bunch of recovery, which is pretty cool to do. Otherwise, I think that's mainly it for the defenses. For the Fizz mid, we're basically not mitigating much Fizz, except for like the stuff we're getting from Fortify and stuff like that. We're basically relying on just having a really big hit pool for Fizz, because again, all the Fizz damage is taken from mana before life. Now, it's not fully, of course, we are draining our mana, especially mid-maps with Plague Bearer, but since the mana leech just completely tops you off, as long as you're hitting things, it's completely maxed pretty much all the time. There can be slight problems, and you need to sort of get used to playing this, but if you, for example, have killed a pack and there's like one straggler or something, and you don't see him, what can happen is the Plague Bearer setup, since it's like rammed with Indigon at that point, it probably drains your mana down, and then you get really vulnerable to Fizz, because you lose most of your health pool functionally. But then as long as you get some hits in and you start leashing again, it'll be super fine. So this actually is pretty powerful, especially for the Rogue Exile maps that I showed at the start. Because those mobs do so much Fizz damage, just having this massive hit pool for Fizz alongside full instant leech makes it so that as long as they don't one-shot you, you sort of just infinitely sustain against them. And it actually feels really good to play. Surprisingly good, actually. I didn't really expect it, but yeah, it's actually very good for those maps because they're always around you. You're always leeching and topping yourself off, so they sort of just don't kill you. There's some issues with like the, specifically Xandro, you know, the hits can't be evaded guy. That guy, if you juice a bunch of map mods, he gets like Soul Eater and whatever. He gets very rippy, as I'm sure any evasion character can tell, but otherwise everything else just kind of falls over, and it actually worked really well defensively as well as offensively for those maps, so I've been quite enjoying that. Otherwise, of course, we're getting fully suppressed capped. There is an argument you could also go into here and do Magebane. Magebane with this much dex fully gives you suppression cap basically for free. Of course, you do lose quite a bit of evasion doing that, but what you could do is you could go like, and I tried this out a little bit, it doesn't actually feel too bad. You could spec over into Magebane and then take Acrobatics, which is this thing without the Lethal Pride Jewel. Acrobatics gives you spell dodge instead of suppression at half the value. So because Magebane gives you so much just pure spell suppression with this amount of dex, it basically almost spell dodge caps you on its own. So it's not actually the worst. At 75% spell block, you can get a decent hit pull. It actually feels quite good. But I think for this character at this point, it doesn't really feel worth. But that is a thing to keep in mind. I think it actually is not bad. Well, yeah, I think that's basically the defensive layers. If you want to look at the tree fully, it's basically just pathing around to a bunch of mana nodes. We're going crit, so taking some nodes in order to get crit capped. Getting crit capped is a little tricky because right now I'm not using a diamond flask. You could do that, but I decided to just use a suffix instead. A little bit tight on the flasks for Mage Blood. You have some slots you really want to use, so I couldn't really fit in a diamond flask, but that's why I'm taking like this cluster right here for crit chance. I believe the character's sitting on close to like 88 or 90% crit chance right now, which I'm pretty happy with, especially with the damage the character has. It's pretty good. Otherwise, it's basically just like it's an Adorned build. Which I believe, I don't know where I put it here. Yeah, we're doing Adorned stuff now. So basically it's just pathing to a bunch of voices and taking the voice nodes and putting a bunch of these jewels in. Now, I don't think actually Adorned is the most efficient. You probably get more stats out of using small clusters. So you can sort of use clusters like this, right? Where you have small cluster increased effect and then like a big dex roll with like all attributes and then openness as the final mod. Openness just gives you a bunch of mana. These are really efficient and actually give you a lot of damage and survivability. They're very good and probably point by point better than Adorned jewels. The nice part about Adorned is that you can get AoE as an implicit on these, so as a synth implicit, and that is one of the like unique ways you can scale AoE on the character. Otherwise, you'd probably have to use like something like Enhance in the Rage Vortex setup. Enhance would give you quality, and Rage Vortex of Berserking quality gives you base radius. So you'd probably have to do like Enhance and then enhance some of the qualities here in order to get more AoE. And that is fine, but of course you're missing out on the full link there, and that's quite a lot of damage. With an Adorned setup, suddenly you get a bunch of extra AoE percents just from all these magic jewels you sorted, which is very cool, and I think it makes it worth. So you can see that's how this character right now has a pretty big circle. This is not even that invested. You can get this to be, I believe, the size of like 2 full screens. I've seen some crazy POBs, but I feel like this is a fine size for me right now. But, you know, of course, more AoE feels better, but yeah, this already feels really good. And yeah, that's one of the main big benefits of using Adorned, is being able to just scale AoE through those jewels. But yeah, so yeah, late game setup, you're using Adorned, so Adorned trees all look pretty similar. As I said, recovery-wise, we are leeching mana is the main thing, so we're getting mana leech from here. We're also getting life leech from here, so that's quite nice. Taking the instant leech mastery for the life leech and also the ES leech. We are leeching ES from this Stonebreaker node right here. You can either get it off a Megalomaniac like this, or just take it from the Lord Cluster. This is why originally I was using this Lord Cluster, because it has the Stonebreaker, and this is a very important node, because getting ES attack leech is actually very rare. This is one of the few sources of it, so you kind of have to have one of these somewhere. I just ended up getting it on this Megalomaniac, and that saves me a point, so that's why I ended up using that. Otherwise, you know, power charge stuff. Here we're still in a lighter meaning. This helps Chaos Risk Kappas. It's pretty good. You can also, I popped a few versions of this character where you path through the middle. It's pretty good. You can like put a lot of meaning in here and then like an unnatural in here, or maybe swap those around and you get a bunch of good stuff. Unnatural in here is actually very nice because you get all these mana nodes and you also get a bunch of these AoE nodes. It's kind of juicy actually. Sort of makes me want to do it, but I think for now this version is a little bit more efficient for the character. But yeah, there's an argument to path through the middle as well. It's pretty good. I think at that point you probably do take Magebane. That's pretty good. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the tree. There's nothing too crazy otherwise. Yeah, basically just take some life ES nodes here. This master's pretty good for Chaos Res mitigation. I don't know if I really need it, but felt pretty good to take. As for the gear itself, of course we're using Mana Storm, Indigon, and then the big crazy axe you maybe saw the crafting video of. So there's the big explodey stat stick, which is very, very juiced. Really juiced up your character. Also gives you, importantly, 2 to 4 cold damage to attacks per 10 dex. This is actually bigger than you might think because it enables you to freeze things, and you do freeze things a lot actually with this character at this point in time, which is very nice. And if you even want more freeze, you can use these forbidden jewels right here. These are actually very, very good. I'm not using them right now because I don't think I really need them with this level of damage, but this is a really powerful defensive layer, especially in rogue exile maps. So even if you don't have like, I think if you have like 1500 decks with this Synth Blizzard, this will enable you to very reliably get these 2-second freezes from Oath of Winter. So yeah, I would really recommend, if you're doing something like this with the axe, you to try out using the Forbidden Flame of Flesh for Oath of Winter is very, very good, especially if you're doing like really difficult content like Rogue Exiles, because just getting that 2-second freeze is really powerful, especially if you're deling the maps. You get 2-second freezes on the enemies, and then they do the big deli slam thing that also just stuns them for like 5 seconds or something. So basically you just have a bunch of free uptime on like all the exiles, and it's a very powerful defensive layer. So would really recommend doing this. You can't unfortunately really do this unless you have that Synth Blizzard on this weapon. There's no real other way of getting a bunch of cold damage, because most of your damage is going to be, you do a little bit of fizz and then mostly lightning because of Mana Storm, unfortunately. So it is sort of a thing you can really only start doing once you have this weapon, but or a similar weapon like it. But it is a very cool thing to do once you do have it. It's very, very powerful. Also, a nice thing about cold damage, getting an additional source of cold damage like this means that you can run Trinity in your Rage Vortex setup. So Trinity is a very powerful gem, but you do need to have 2 different damage types that have similar ranges, where they sort of Venn diagram overlap in the damage ranges. So before the cold damage mod, there was really no way of easily getting that on this character, because again, you do basically all lightning. But with this mod, you easily do enough cold damage to always proc a Trinity and just permanently have it fully up, which is a lot of damage. Trinity is a very, very good support gem once you're able to trigger it. So a bunch of benefits from having the cold damage mod on this weapon. Otherwise, of course, it's a very good weapon. Just deals a bunch of damage, which is nice. As with the chest piece, just having the attack speed mod per 25 decks, and on a necrotic standard deck stacking one, just made this recently actually just upgraded. I would say not really necessary getting the attack speed mod on there, but it is basically like 15-20% damage, more if you're not using these gloves. But yeah, it's a very powerful mod for sure, and also makes you leaf stun very quickly, which is cool. As I said, Indigon and Mana Storm, you probably want to get like a crit reduction corruption on this thing, but I've not been able to find one of those. I probably need to make one myself, which is a little bit annoying. For the amulet, I'm using an Eyes of the Great Wolf with attributes of mana. These are very good. The best possible amulet you can get is a perfect one of those, so fully 16% to 30% roll on an Eyes of the Great Wolf. These basically don't exist, so I wouldn't count on that. The second best would be a Simplex with like Dex and probably the Temple Mana mod. There are a couple of those made, I think, in the league right now, and those are basically on par. I think they're a little bit worse than a perfect Eyes of the Great Wolf, but they're very close and are much more easily obtainable. I mean, easily, you have to mirror them, but given that a perfect Eyes of the Great Wolves would be like several mirrors probably, it's a lot cheaper, and they're very, very similar output-wise. So that's probably what you want to do for a really perfect setup, but this one that I'm using has been totally good, and it's not even that well-rolled, right? But it has been good enough. For the ring, using a reflected helical. Obviously, if you don't have the funds to reflect these, and I know it's pretty expensive to try and get done, just use a regular one, just craft one, and then we're just reflecting that with the ring. I have to be a little bit careful with this setup right now, since we are doing the weapon swap disabling tech, because all attributes, like sources of flat all attributes, which normally would be really good to have on this ring, because obviously it gives you more dex. It's kind of dangerous because it gives you a bunch of ints and a bunch of strength, and it gets very hard to balance your attributes if you have all attributes on your ring, unfortunately. So that is something that you probably don't want to get if you want to do the Indigon disable tech. So that's why I don't have it for one. Now we're doing Mage Flood. For certain maps, especially if you're doing like a bunch of Nemesis, like juicing of monster modifiers, Headhunter is actually quite a bit better than Mage Flood for this character. But just for Rogue Exile specifically, which is what I've been playing the last week or so, Mage Flood is a lot better because there are not a lot of rare mobs in there, and they don't have that many modifiers. So Mage Flood is a lot better for that, and of course enables a bunch of stuff. As for the Mage Flood flasks we are using, currently using Quicksilver, which I would never play a Mage Flood build without Quicksilver, I don't think, unless maybe it's like a build that only movement skills or something like that. But yeah, Quicksilver is just too good. Can't not have it. Then I'm using a Jade Flask, again, to scale the little bit of percent evasion we're getting from the deck stacking, which is quite nice. And then using a Quartz Flask, so phasing is really important for the character. So I like just having a Quartz Flask. Just having unconditional permanent phasing is very good. You could also take this mastery out here. I'm currently using it just because it gives 8% suppress, but the phasing, if you have suppressed spell damage recently, that is actually more reliable than you think. So you could use that as your source of phasing, and then maybe get suppress somewhere else and just use another flask here. Maybe throw in a diamond there. It would be an option, because this thing gives you 19% suppress, so you can probably get that somewhere else, maybe off the tree or something, and then swap this for another flask, which could be good. But for now, I like having the Quartz Flask there. Permanent phasing is very nice, and then the Ruby to go alongside the Sublime Vision Purifier setup. So that is very good. As for the unique flask, I'm using a Bottle of Faith right now. It's either that or like you could use Progenesis. Progenesis is less good on this character because of course we're splitting damage between all these different sources. So Progenesis only affects your life. So it would only take place after, first of all, you've drained all your ES, and then you start taking damage on your life and mana, and then of course it's not even affecting all the damage because close to half the damage gets split to your mana. So Progenesis unfortunately is not really the best for this setup, but it's still a decent flask for sure. Bottle of Faith is good because of course again we're having some trouble quick capping. I figured I should mention as well for the snapshotting, you can snapshot Ambush. Ambush is sort of works like a Dim Cry where it also exerts, and that Ambush gives you like basically infinite base crit and some crit multi. So basically quick caps you very, very easily on its own. So you could be snapshotting Ambush and using that instead of Intimidating Cry and basically crit cap for free. That is something you could do. Personally, I found the numbers on that to look a little bit worse when I PB'd it, and also Ambush you need to cast with a target, so it needs to have something to target, so you dash to it and do the ambush, which just feels a lot more awkward to use than just being able to shell whenever. Like that's very comfortable, but having to actually ambush an enemy and like target them and stuff like that, it doesn't feel great. So personally, I think Intim Shout is a little bit better, but yeah, you can certainly use Ambush as well if you want an easier time getting crit capped, but it is going to be a little bit less damage and it is going to feel pretty awkward, I think, but that is it. For the glove slot, we are using Soul Ascensions, so you could also use Shaper's Touch. That would be a pretty tanky option because you'd gain 1,000 flat life or something. You'd gain quite a bit of life, which would be nice, but these gloves are actually really good, especially for Rogue Exile maps. So these give you Soul Eater stacks when you hit rare or unique enemies, and you get 2 of those a second. Usually you don't have that many of these up in normal maps because you don't hit things that often, but in Rogue Exile maps, there's so many rare and uniques everywhere, and they're pretty tanky, so you get quite a few hits off of them. For most of the maps, as long as you're chaining mobs, you can keep, close to max stacks of this up permanently for like the entire map, and once you're doing that, these gloves become insane. They basically become like a full 100% more damage multiplier. So yeah, they're very powerful in those maps, so that's why I'm using them here. Also give you a little bit of chaos res, which is nice. Also, it's just fun having Soul Leader, so that is also an added benefit. So yeah, we're using those gloves, but otherwise you can use Shaper's Touch, and that'll make you quite a bit tankier as well. As for the boots, we're going to have a crafting video on this up in a little bit, but yeah, we're using these really juicy Onslaught Synth boots. They're very cool. Made these fairly recently. If you don't have these, you can just use any old pair of Eldritch boots, or like even you can do Influence boots if you want to do like real speedy, Tailwheel Onslaught Elusive boots are really good. I was using a pair of those for a very long time, and you get a lot of speed out of that. Unfortunately, Rage Vortex of Berserking doesn't actually scale with Tailwind, so you don't get more damage out of the Tailwind. Because it doesn't scale with action speed, unfortunately. But you just get a lot of move speed, which feels very good. So you could use those as well. As for Ailment immunity, you could use, since obviously a Mage build, you could drop a flask suffix on here. These suffixes I'm using in my flasks right now are crit chance. I'm using the life regen. You can swap this for evasion. I'm using curse reduction. I think that's a must, especially in all these Rogue Exile maps where you get so many. Like they're all 8 mods and they all have so many curses. I think having curse reduction is pretty important here. And then for the final one, I'm using a Stun Avoid. Stun is actually a pretty big annoyance for the character, as is probably the case with most mana stackers, because you don't have that big of a pure life pool, and that is how the stuns are calculated. You get stunned a lot, so having some sort of stun immunity is pretty big. You can also do it feels a little awkward, but you can just use Soul of the Divine King for stun immunity, and that feels okay. Because of course, if you get stunned and you have the Storm up, it still does damage. It's just you can't move. Which is, not ideal, but you can use this for your stun immunity, and it feels okay. I was using that for a while, but it is nice to just be able to permanently avoid being stunned as well. But yeah, for Ailment immunity, what you can do is you can maybe drop the stun and get Shock Avoid there and use a Storm Shroud. You can also get like an Ancestral Vision. What I'm actually doing right now is we have these boots which have a Void Shield on them. I'm using them in together with Brine King for freeze immunity, and then I'm using a Adorned Jewel with reduced effect of shock. So this gives you, with Adorned, a 48% reduced effect of shock. This will then stack with the Minor Pantheon of 60. So this will basically disable all shocks on you. So you're freeze, chill, and shock immune. Ignites don't really do much to you because you have 95 res and it gets split and stuff. And it's really not that big of a deal. Doing this makes you basically ailment immune to everything but alt ailments. So you can still get sapped and brittle and stuff like that, but those are pretty rare. So for now, I'm trying this out, but I might end up swapping back to the Storm Shroud setup or the Ancestral Vision setup. If you're doing Magebane, Ancestral Vision gets really good because you can almost get full avoidance just purely with this one keystone. You need a little bit more. Usually when I click this, I have like 80% avoid with Ancestral Vision. So you need a little bit more, but it gets very close. And if you have more decks than me, then yeah, you might be able to fully avoid cap with just Magebane, which is kind of powerful. So here is the current POB. I'm going to have this in the description as well. So you can see some of the stats going on here. sitting at close to 400 mil DPS. This is with close to max soldier stacks. You can lower this if you want, like 20 or something. It's like more reliable than your 30, 300 mil. But in Rogue Exile maps, you can actually very reliably keep your stock stacks up. So I'm just gonna keep it up here because, why not? Those are the maps I'm doing, right? Power Frenzies, we're getting power charges from Assassin Mark, and we're getting Frenzies from Blood Rage. And then, I don't think there's too much cheating going on here. You can see our max hits here, pretty tanky. Now, I will say always take max hit numbers with a grain of salt, especially for mana stackers, because of course this is not fully relevant. You're using your mana all the time. Sometimes your mana is down, and then these numbers don't match up. But if mana is full, we are quite tanky, especially given that I don't even think I have... I don't even have Arcane Cloak ticked here, so you can tick that if you want really big numbers. But of course, we are not using Arcane Cloak strictly for like damage. This is mostly more of a big spender skill, so it's more of an enabler. So I do still use this on cooldowns. It is still up a fair bit of time, but it's not really meant to be there as a guard skill. It more just procs the Indigon is the ideal. I think numerically this skill is really up there. Doing this much damage on like a 70% effectiveness skill is pretty cool, especially given that you get to basically play RF that just scales forever. And this character uses a bunch of cool tech that probably won't be available next league because it uses a bunch of cool Whisper stuff very well. So I've been having a lot of fun with it for sure. And as for the gem setups, we gotta go over. So for the Raid Vortex setups, obviously Raid Vortex, then I'm putting Awaken AoE and Pulverize in the main weapon link here. And then on the craft of the weapon, I'm crafting on 8% increased quality of socketed gems. This gets also snapshot with the links, because I guess it affects the gems, and the gems are snapshot, I suppose. But yeah, this puts Raid Vortex, if you get a 21-23 one, or like a 20-23 one, the 8 extra quality to it pushes it over 30, which is the next breakpoint for the quality to give you another 0.1 radius. So that gives you quite a bit of AoE. And then also increased AoE. Okay, this one doesn't actually scale with quality, but Polarize gives you also more AoE for quality. So that is why those two are in there for the quality. And then Awaken AoE just gives you a little bit more damage, I suppose. Otherwise, also using Volatility, Trinity, and Fortify. Went over Fortify and Trinity. Volatility just gives you a bunch of damage because the character still, even though we have the added cold from the weapon implicit, we are still doing mainly lightning damage because, Mana Storm just gives you that much flat. As for other links, using Sigil Power with, AoE and duration, you don't need these support gems here, but I just have slots open, so might as well make a really big Sigil Power. Sigil Power is really good because, of course, you're spending so much mana. You can put it down and basically just instantly have it max stages, which is very nice. Gives you basically another source of Fortify functionally. Gives you 24% less damage, which is pretty good, especially when it's as large as it is when you're scaling it like this. Otherwise, using Assassin Mark for the curse, just for the crit, which is pretty good. Again, crit capping is something that is very much in our interests. So Mark and Assassin Mark need to figure something to do with this socket. Otherwise, we're using Phase Run. So this is the main thing we're using to proc Mana Storm. So basically, the general rotation of a character is, and you have to do things in sort of a specific order for this character, is you want to be web swap to your link setup, you want to shout, you want to Rage Vortex of Berserking, and then you want to weapon swap, and then instantly Arcane Cloak while you're at full mana. So this will get your Plague Bear started and start scaling. You don't want to do like Phase Run and then Arcane Cloak, because then Phase Run will spend your mana and then not give you too much damage on its own, and then you can't fully Arcane Cloak. So you want to make sure you Arcane Cloak first thing after you weapon swap initially. So that's pretty big deal. But we're using Phase Run. So after you've done that initial setup, you can just spam Phase Run off cooldown basically, because Phase Run has a 4-second cooldown and the Mana Storm buff has a 4-second duration, so they line up very nicely. So you can just spam Phase Run on cooldown and it'll continuously keep up your Mana Storm for all that nice flat damage. So that is very cool. You can also keep spamming Arcane Cloak on cooldown. You generally have enough mana to do it, and it'll help your ramp a little bit, and also give you the whole defensive and offensive value that thing does actually give you. So you can also do that on cooldown. You have plenty of mana for it, luckily. So you have that linked with Blood Rage. It doesn't do anything, but yeah, I've enhanced in here in Arcane Cloak. Arcane Cloak is the thing I'm using in order to disable the helmet, because a level 21 Arcane Cloak requires 159 int, and that is how this is getting disabled. You can also disable it with Strength. I've seen people do that. So you can use Strength or int. You just have to balance your stats around. Personally, I decided like having more strength on the character is a little bit better, because strength gives you life, and life is good. So it feels nicer to balance with int. A little problem with balancing with int is that your chest piece requires a lot of int, just baseline. So I have to use this tailoring orb on my chest, 40% reduced attribute requirements. You can use that, or you can use, there's another tailoring orb that also gives you like 25% reduced, which would be plenty. So I have to use that on the chest, unfortunately, in order to be able to equip it. But that's not the biggest deal in the world, honestly. But yeah, that is the downside of using int. The downside of using strength in order to disable Indigon would be that you probably have to de-level your Rage Vortex 1 level in order to make this not require 159 strength, because you want the disabler to beat the 159 strength benchmark, right? So you'd probably have to go down a level of Rage Vortex, which is a damage loss. So that's probably the big drawback, alongside losing a little bit of flat life. You get some strength, but you can do either one and it's fine. Otherwise, using Intimidating Cry with the Urgent Warriors just to make that fast, and then faster attacks. Leap Slam is the travel skill. I just like having one. Leap Slam feels really good, especially when you have the chest mod to give you a bunch of attack speed. It's nice and fast. I'm a big fan of Leap Slam, so that is cool. And then we're doing Eternal Blessing, Purity Fire. Purity Fire, of course, enables the whole Sublime setup. Gives you 90 auras alongside the Ruby Flask, and yeah, it works really well. Eternal Blessing, basically just as long as you're not reserving any mana to anything else, you get one free aura. So that is our free aura. Which is quite nice. As for the Plague Bearer setup itself, so a little bit involved here. Like, you can probably math this out and make a really perfect setup for it. I'm sure this is not optimal, but this is what I've been using for now, and it's been working quite well with my current setup. But this depends on like the amount of mana you have and stuff. I was working on a spreadsheet for calculating mana cost of this. It's like halfway done. Maybe I'll finish it one day, but I got sidetracked. But basically, what I'm doing is obviously automation, Plague Bearer, the core. Then I'm socketing Arcane Surge alongside Conk Effect. So Conk Effect doesn't do anything for the build. It's just an AoE tagged support gem, so it gives that 140% mana cost multiplier, basically just making the base cost of Plague Bearer higher, so it'll scale faster. Same thing applies to Arcane Surge, also a cost multiplier, so 130%. Arcane Surge also has the added benefit of it just basically giving you permanent Arcane Surge, which, you know, gives you some mana regen, a little bit nice, but it's mainly just there because it makes the Plague Bearer cost more mana. And then I actually have it socketed with Convocation. Convocation is another skill that just gets spammed. Full quality Convocation with an Enhance. So you can see Enhance right here. It gives a cooldown of about 2 seconds, so this spams once every 2 seconds and just spends mana that way. So these two together will just spend mana and ramp you faster and faster. So for me personally, having just Plague Bearer on its own wasn't quite enough, or it didn't feel fast enough, so I just put another thing in there. You can also use War Banners. War Banners, contrary to what you might think, actually are spammable like this. However, they are only spammable while you're hitting enemies. So while you're hitting enemies and gaining Valor, they will just spam them every second, because War Banners have a second cooldown, so they actually work really well for the setup. The problem with War Banners for me right now is that they have the aura tag, and of course I'm using Sublime Vision, which disables all the other auras, so I actually can't use banners. But if you don't use Sublime Vision, I would recommend probably instead of a Convocation to try and maybe put a banner in there, because the banners are generally just better because they have shorter cooldowns and will spend more mana. But yeah, that's the whole gist of the setup with the Plague Bearer. Yeah, there's definitely some tweaking or like optimizing to do with the setup, but right now I think this has been working quite well for me, and very noticeably gives you a bunch of Indigon stacks very quickly, and that is nice, and also has pretty good uptime. So I think that's pretty much it for the character right now. There's some things I want to work on. I still want to work on the defense of the character. I'm pretty happy with the damage. Like at full ramp having 400 mil, and like even not full ramp having like 300 mil is really, really good. More than enough for the exiles. Even if you stack like a bunch of extra life mods, they still just die. So damage is plenty there. I just kind of want to stack a bit more defenses. I'll get a really big hit pool, I think, is probably the strat for this character. So yeah, I think probably the move is going to be trying to fit in more Will Shapers and then just getting a bunch more mana. Maybe like put a Healthy Mind in here, take these nodes right here to get a bunch of mana. Something like that, in order to just get a big mana pool and then get a bunch of ES. I think that is probably the most efficient way of building defenses right now for this character. And I'm going to try and put that together. But otherwise, I'm very happy with it. I mean, for any concept that's not Rogue Exile farming, which is like, I think Rogue Exile farming, once you get all the juiced idols and things, which I currently have, is like probably the hardest content in the game, like probably by far, I would guess. So that is the benchmark I'm currently using, and it works really well for those. It's just basically, as I said, if you run into like a really juiced up Soul Eater Xandro, that gets rough. That dude can pop you because his can't be evaded is rough, but otherwise everything else just kind of falls over. But I think with a decent enough hit pool, even Xandro can be beat, so that is what I'm working on right now. But yeah, super fun character, a lot of moving pieces, and a very, very interesting build to think about and to play around with. And like stuff like the disabling tech, like it works so well because like Indigon doesn't even have any defenses on it really. Like weapon swapping, you lose a little bit of ES. You can see I'm losing like what 600-700 ES, which is, you know, not nothing, but otherwise it's like nothing really changes. So it's not like a big defensive deficit to disable it when you're weapon swapping either. And besides, even with this enabled, when you're weapon swapping and casting Rage Vortex, it's not like it was doing damage anyway on this weapon sweat. It's really only, as anyone who's played this build can testify, it only really starts doing damage when you actually weapon swap, and it just does 1,000,000 damage. So yeah, the disabling tech is so cool, and I'm so happy we found it. It makes the build just play like butter, in my opinion. It feels very good. But yeah, very cool character, very fun. I'm going to keep playing it. I'm actually not bored of the league just yet, because I've been having so much fun with this character, so I'm probably going to keep playing for at least quite a bit longer. So yeah, been having fun. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'll be back with more stuff. We have more crafting videos coming up. I have a video of these boots, so a bit of spoiler there. They're going to get crafted, and yeah, that's all very cool. Thanks for all the support as always, super appreciated. I know I take long hiatuses between content, but I'm super happy that all of you guys stick around and watch all the videos, so thank you very much for that. Yeah, super cool. Actually, I usually don't do like the whole meta YouTube talk in these videos because I don't like that stuff very much, but just yeah, thank you very much for watching, and yeah, much appreciated. So very fun character, back with more videos in the future. So thanks everyone.